It is a great honor to welcome Paul Gottfried on this show. He is a political philosopher and the editor-in-chief of Chronicles magazine. How are you today, Paul? Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
I should first like to begin by asking you about the magazine in which you're serving as editor-in-chief, Chronicles. What is its mission statement and what kind of articles or essays do you publish there?
Well, it is I suppose it can be described as a culturally traditionalist or conservative magazine. I have written for it since its founding, which goes back 40 years. And I'm currently the editor-in-chief, but there is, a very helpful, efficient staff that does most of the production work for the magazine. Um, we uh, we treat a number of subjects. I mean, politics, culture, music, occasionally music, although not as much as we used to. We used to have somebody who wrote regularly on music. We have poetry. Um, I think it would be fair, however, to say the critical thrust of the magazine is political and political theoretical, although we occasionally treat theological and philosophical questions as well.
I see.
And at one time, we had over 25,000 subscribers. Now we're struggling with subscriptions. We have a little more than 5,000. We sell about 5,000 on the newsstand, but it is extremely difficult to try to get our subscription numbers back up to where they were before. One major reason being that there are just fewer and fewer people under the age of 40 who read print magazines. They typically read things that are digitalized. So we might end the market for conservative magazines is somewhat limited, and we were overtaken by other magazines. Since the 1990s, when we reached our highest subscription numbers. So we are struggling a bit with that. The quality of the magazine, I think, is superb. I think it is fair to say they were one of the best written and most interesting magazines in the English language.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'm one of those audience under 40 who's very interested in reading print journalism, specifically magazines. Right. So I guess I will be a potential subscriber of Chronicles. And
if you leave me an address, our CEO will make sure that you get a magazine.
Okay,
thank you. Free magazine.
Thank you very much.
Whet your appetite for our material.
And yeah, anyone who's listening who's interested in conservative traditionalist takes on American culture, then Chronicle magazines is the place to go.
Yeah, so, I might also mention that, as you might have guessed, my own interest are German history and German philosophy, and I speak and write German. And I suppose I'm sort of a traditionalist in my taste in things German as well. I sort of like the 19th century philosophers, sociologists. The latest issue has a long article on me called "The Hitler of Legend," which I recommend because it sort of goes against the grain. It shows to what extent the notion of Hitler as somebody who was raised in a deeply anti-Semitic environment, was an anti-Semite from his birth on or from his early years on, is a myth. And Brigitte Hamann's book, Hitler's Wien, I think is sort of groundbreaking in showing why it's a myth, that even as late as Hitler's years in Vienna between 1909 and 1913, there is no evidence he was an anti-Semite of any kind, nor his parents, whose closest friend was Jewish, the Jewish doctor who cared for Hitler's mother when she was dying of cancer. So that, and I try to explain why there is an attempt to show that Hitler was an anti-Semite from his earliest years on, because it's a way of indicting Austro-German society at the time, which I think is very important for the anti-fascist left in Germany and in other countries, Germany and Austria. And those prejudices may have been there, but they're not reflected in the young Hitler as far as I can see. And I think the essays, I always try to write something that is iconoclastic. Despite my age, I've always been an iconoclastic historian, and I've always challenged liberal cliches.
Mhm. So, have you had a compelling answer to the conundrum of why did Germany, who has produced such great musicians, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner, and etc., and great philosophers such as Hegel, Kant, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and so on, produce such massive atrocities like Hitler and Goebbels?
Well, it's not uh, unthinkable that a society that is intellectually and culturally rich also produces monstrous people. There's a famous book by Jacob Burckhardt on the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, showing that they produce both monstrous people in great art and architecture and so forth. That these are not great poets. These are not incompatible. Um, great culture nations that produce great culture also can produce monstrosities, and I think that that is definitely true. I'm not saying one necessarily produces the other, but the coexistence of the two is not anything that that really puzzles me.
Mhm. So, in this hour, we are focusing on Herbert Marcuse, whom you've studied under, but at the
Yes.
same time, we can dive into other thoughts of the great
Mhm.
thinkers who are his contemporaries and his predecessors.
Mhm.
Um, so, this is something that really surprises me because you identify yourself as a conservative or a paleo-conservative, but Marcuse was famously a leftist, or at least he's a
Mhm.
scion of left-wing students. So, how do you reconcile these two beliefs?
Yeah, I don't really find it a problem at all. I mean, this may be surprising. Um, I would think that it's impossible to be part of the woke left and be a conservative of any kind. The contemporary left is woke. I would argue it's not essentially Marxist, and you cannot attack gender identity and call yourself any kind of conservative or favor gay marriage and be, because I think that these things are utterly incompatible with conservatism.
Mhm.
But in my view, one can present Marxist interpretations of history and still be a conservative. And when I knew Marcuse, he really had not gone over the deep end entirely, which he did after he went out to California and taught. I think it was at San Diego. So it was just one of the two famous universities at San Diego. And you see in a student like Angela Davis, who was also a student, you see real nuttiness, and it may have reflected views of her teacher at the time. But I'm a few years older than Angela, and I just didn't see this from Marcuse, who was my teacher. I learned a lot of Hegel from him, and I think he was very erudite in German philosophy, European intellectual history, and one can read One Dimensional Man and notice the Heideggerian elements in that work, which I did, after reading the work years later. And that is definitely not a woke leftist work of
Mhm.
any kind. Um, and as I've argued, I've always taken ideas, useful ideas, where I find them. Um, one of the places that I do not look for important ideas today is the American conservative movement, which may be okay when they talk about, you know, the um, the Steele dossier or something like that. Their ideas are essentially reworked leftist ideas from 20 years ago, and the media celebrities just strike me generally as dumb. So that I've learned less. The first generation of American conservatives, the ones who influenced me from like the 1950s, were in many cases highly intelligent, like Robert Nisbet, James Burnham. There were things in Russell Kirk that I liked, and so forth. The people who come later are much less important thinkers, and from the 1980s on, if you know anything about my biography, I was pretty much pushed out of the conservative movement by the neoconservatives when they took over. And for a number of years, I wrote for sort of quasi-Marxist magazines. This doesn't bother me at all. And the conservatives didn't want me, so I wrote for a Marxist magazine. Although I am on the right, I'm on the traditional right. But I really don't see any incompatibility. I would also say that since the end of the Cold War, I find the anti-Marxism of the American conservative movement very tiresome. First of all, the woke left is not Marxist. It is culturally radical, and is more culturally radical than the Frankfurt School was. And the conservative movement has pretty much absorbed its ideas, while flogging a Marxist dead horse. It's not and then loudly proclaiming the Chinese government to be communist. They're a Chinese nationalist government that has some sort of communist window dressing. So I find, and in fact, the communist parties in Europe today are in some cases very conservative. The Russian Communist Party voted against gay marriage and gay instruction in school. The Communist Party in Hungary is a nationalist party today. So I would not waste my time flogging a Marxist dead horse, and nor do I reject teachers because they call themselves Marxist. I also, have read with great profit the work of Gramsci. I think he's a highly intelligent man, with some very deep insights into social institutions.
Well, personally, one of the biggest influence on my conservatism is, unfortunately, one you might dislike, Irving Kristol. I find
You're right.
I find a lot of insight and intellect in his work, and and I think at the beginning, the neoconservatism for me is, an intellectual jolt in what we call traditional conservatism. It brings new issues and I guess insights into the movement at the time. But I do admit that unlike Whittaker Chambers, Irving Kristol, I believe, remained a liberal. He doesn't have an awakening and then he moved from the right. He remained a liberal, whereas the left becomes more radical. That's what neoconservatives are.
No, I think you're right. I think there is a transformation that neoconservatism undergoes. The second generation of neoconservatives, if you like, move from Irving Kristol to Bill Kristol, becomes more leftist. So that Bill Kristol, Max Boot, Jennifer Rubin, all these people, Jonah Goldberg, they're well to the left of the neoconservatives of the 1980s on every social question. What they have, however, kept are two things. One, this global democratic foreign policy, in which they want to bring whatever the conception of human rights that exist in the United States, the benighted third world, or people who have not been fully converted to this redemptive doctrine. And the other thing is the strong support for Israel, because many of them are Jewish and they're Zionist. I think the notion that they're controlled by the Israeli government is nonsense. I think they try to control the Israeli government. I think it's exactly the opposite. They have much more power and influence. But and they still remain a very powerful force. One of the distinctions I think is important to make is between conservatism in America as it existed before the neocons took over, and what I call paleoconservatism. Paleoconservatism is not what the right was, is not coextensive with the right before the neoconservatives took over. It's a new movement. It was a reaction against the neoconservatives. I was one of the leaders, and we reacted against them. We did not like the direction in which they took the conservative movement, and it took them irreversibly. But we were not saying that everything that went before was good. I mean, it's sort of the way European counter-revolutionaries thought in the early 19th. They did not say that everything before the French Revolution was good. They were very critical. Burke is very critical of, the Ancien regime in France, but at the same time thinks the course that was charted by the revolutionaries was wrong. It was dangerous. And that is my view of neoconservatism. It's not that everything that preceded it was good. If everything that preceded it was good, they would not have taken over. People would not have run to serve them. So there were lots of things that were wrong with the pre-neoconservative right. But there were things that were right about them, which the neoconservatives get rid of. So I think we sort of selectively look back at what was worth preserving, not only in the pre-neocon right, but also in the interwar right, in the United States. There were things in the 1930s and even earlier about what was called conservatives that I think have to be reassessed and in some cases incorporated into an intellectual, into the present intellectual right.
Yes. I believe by the time that Reagan was campaigning and got elected, some of the members of the old traditional conservatives, like Russell Kirk, he basically got pushed out of the movement, and you have the neoconservatives drop in. And I think one of the tragedies of that movement, and which I have a lot of respect for, is that they ran out of steam just at the moment that they have like almost all the power and influence within the conservative movement. Therefore, Iraq War. But we do see that the neoconservatives are now getting a taste of their own medicine in that they're pushed out, and people like Christo and Booth and Rubin are, yelling at clouds at the moment, and people who are traditionalists and populists, they call themselves, I guess, national conservatives now. They are the intellectual cauldron of the conservative movement going forward now.
I think you're right. I think the momentum is definitely, if you look through the field of energy, the momentum or the dynamic is definitely with the populist right. However, the neoconservatives cannot be counted out. They still have lots of real estate. You cannot say they're gone. I mean, they still run the Wall Street Journal. They still run National Review. National Review tries to make room for some others, sort of, for decoration, but they are neoconservative. I mean, they still pretty much call the shots on Fox News. So you really can say that they're out. They're just less powerful than they were before. And they've also left their influence, I think, indelibly on the conservative movement. You don't see much of the, of the pre-neoconservative right. The populist movement is something else. I mean, it does incorporate some paleo elements, but then the paleos are not the same as the pre-neocon right. They're closer to it than the neocons, but they are something different. And yet you really cannot go back. I mean, I think they're irreversible. The neoconservative takeover is an irreversible change. And this is coming from me, and I have been their worst enemy for 40 years, but it's irreversible. You cannot, and they definitely have influenced the conservative movement. You cannot, and to this very day, they remain the most powerful institutional force, but they're less powerful than they were before. And at least among the younger generation, they don't seem to have very much clout anymore. I mean, their ideas are not, they have very little influence. But it's not that everybody is running back to Russell Kirk or running back to the interwar right. It's just that the neoconservatives, I think, have pretty much become the establishment, and they're much closer to, one might say, CNN than they are to the paleoconservatives. And of course, a lot of the neocons are on CNN, right?
Yeah.
And there are others, of course, that are on Fox. They're on both. So I wouldn't count them out. It's just that they are right now, they're competing with a rising populist force, which seems to be very strong among young people on the right.
I suppose one of the members of the paleo-conservative movement, or at least that's what the media calls him, that is Tucker Carlson. who recently got booted out of Fox. And many of his views, especially on economics and foreign policy, are basically the same thing as people like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren would espouse, who are traditionally associated with the left, in that he's much more economically protectionist, and foreign policy wise, he's very much against intervention. So I wonder, does that mean that in order to preserve, I guess, the traditional conservative as it stands, does that mean you have to incorporate certain elements of philosophers like Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, who are traditionally seen as leftists?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't think Tucker Carlson would ever be mistaken for Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. Although if you go back to Sanders, didn't used to be woke. I mean, he was, although I think he said something nice about gays or something like that, when he was mayor of Burlington, but he was anti-immigration. He thought that this hurts the American working class, which is a traditional communist position, by the way, but also one shared by the populist right. So there is overlap, but they are different. They're different because they're addressing different groups. The left's core constituency is not the white working class. The core constituency of the left is LGBT, feminist, blacks, government workers. It's pretty much the same in Europe. You have to substitute Muslim maybe for blacks or something like that. And these are the these are the groups that all right-wing populists are aiming at, not only in the United States, but in Germany, France. If you read my book on anti-fascism, I show there are overlapping populist themes. That if you look at France, the Rassemblement National of Le Pen or Zemmour's party, they are definitely aiming at the working class, the classe ouvrière. The working class is the electoral base of the right. In the United States too, it is the working class is the electoral base. So that the Wall Street Journal's view that, we're going to be friendly with the corporate capitalists and we're going to give you a tax break or something like this, this has no appeal outside of neoconservatives and maybe some corporate investors and so forth. Although it is pretty much, one might say, still the heart of the Republican Party. But, as you move to the right, there is less and less of an alliance with corporate capitalism and more animosity toward. These are the people who are allied to the woke left. And they don't care about American workers, and they're all in favor of open border. I mean, there's real animosity toward corporate capitalism the farther to the right you move, here and in Europe. It's no different in Europe, in Western Europe. So you have the same sort of populist alliance with the working class. And that I think you see in Tucker. Tucker Carlson is not really, doesn't, only one paleo ever gets onto his show as far as I see, and that is Pedro Gonzalez, who's our senior writer. And Pedro is always on there. Nobody else has ever asked. He never asked me. I'm the oldest and the most established paleo, maybe next to Pat Buchanan. But I'm never asked onto anything. He's a friend of Pedro, but most of the people he has on are, ordinary vanilla conservatives. They're not particularly, and many of Tucker's views are not particularly right wing. Like, he's big on equality. He hates the Southern side in the Civil War. These are all racist. Well, the Southern whites are the basis, a base of the right in the United States. He also is always trying to reach out to the black vote. So there's certain impulses and gestures in Tucker which does not really strike me as being particularly right wing. But then when he gets to attacking the left, there's no one who attacks the left with the same fury. He goes after these people. He's vicious in the way he goes after them. And many of the sponsors, of course, of Fox News are on the left, and, they just sort of try to sponsor this and sponsor CNN or something. Others are neocons, who basically sort of are in the center politically. They're pro-Israel. They're for a neoconservative foreign, but they don't want to sound too bold, and they don't like Tucker's tirades against the left. But if you notice, you even got somebody like Robert Kennedy Jr., who sounds very much like the populist right, and he just claims to be, represent his father's views or something like that. But it is very obvious that somebody like Robert Kennedy Jr. resonates with the populist right much better than, let's say, Mike Pence or Nikki Haley, right? So you have to look at these sort of generic Republican candidates or in the field. So I think what you see is the whole political climate is changing drastically, although the neocons still hold good cards, very good cards, and they still run most of the conservative establishment. I would argue your people are still running it, but there is a populist right, and I don't think Tucker's going to be out. I think he's going to. And by the way, they've taken quite a hit on Fox News. I mean, they're not doing well without Tucker Carlson. And that 8 o'clock slot that he filled has become basically unwatchable. It's so boring. I mean, so they're going to probably need to have the guy come back.
So I think a great thinker that I've been following recently is Michael Lynn. He recently had a new book called How to Pay, and he is I think he's a Democrat, last I heard, but he pays a great deal of attention to the populist climate of that's on both sides, really, and he's also not a big fan of what he calls the uniparty, which consists of neoconservatives and neoliberals. But I want to delve into German philosophy a bit. Nowadays, there's this phrase called critical race theory, and thus far, I've not heard any good definition of it, both from the left and from the right. So I'm still like puzzled as to what it is. But it has its roots in critical theory, which is a discipline founded by the Frankfurt School, where Marcuse was a part of. So could you tell us about the historical and political circumstances in which the Frankfurt School of Social Research was founded and their discipline?
I never really related critical race theory to the kritische Theorie of the Frankfurt Schule. I never really thought they went together. You're right. Critical.
Yeah, me neither.
And of course, you have the critical law taught at Harvard and other places, and they are pretty much centered on the oppression of the Black race by white racist America, and so is critical race theory. It is different, however, from the. It does obviously take its bearings to some extent from the Frankfurter Schule, but I think there are differences. For one thing, certainly the first generation, in German, die Gründergeneration, the founding generation of the Frankfurter Schule, these people were looking at culture, and its effect on emotions, the psychological well-being of people and so forth, and also relating it to economic structures. What they were trying to do in some ways was fuse their version of Freudianism with their version of Marxism, right? And some of the work is quite interesting, like on, some of the early work of Max Horkheimer on the family, I still read with profound interest. They're not writing to condemn an entire race of people who happen to be white. What they're doing is they're trying to show the irrationality of an advanced capitalist society. And Horkheimer, in fact, goes back to an earlier point in time and shows how the bürgerliche Familie, the bourgeois family at some time in the past was much less oppressive than it becomes under late capitalism. And He speaks about die spätere Verwandlung der bürgerlichen family, that it becomes over time transformed because of capitalism. Now, the argument that you're going to get from critical race theory is something much more simplistic and propagandistic. It is simply that America was founded as a racist country, that it was built up by slaves, that racism is, we might say, in the American DNA, and that finally we have to undergo vast socioeconomic and psychological change to overcome our tainted beginnings as a country. It does not have any of the intellectual or methodological sophistication of the Frankfurt School. But I think you're right. I think they may have had that in mind when they began about critical theory or critical race theory. And then before that, the critical legal theory, which is pretty much a forerunner of critical race theory.
I've been thinking a lot about the difference between analytic philosophy, which is founded by the English speakers, and the continental school, which is predominantly German. And in some ways, I can link that to the divide between members of the American conservative movement today, in that there are those who wish to protect the founding, and that being the Enlightenment philosophy that guided the founding. And there are those who are much more European in their persuasion. I was in Hungary a few days ago, and I met Rod Dreher. He's very much a European conservative. Same goes with people like Yoram Hazony and Sorab Amari, the members who would make up the National Conservative Conference. So there are two different versions of conservatism being in conflict with each other. So
I think you're right. I don't know whether I necessarily agree with these people whom you mentioned and all the details of their conservatism, but I think there very definitely is a split. Now, it would not be framed, except in my case, as a defense of German philosophy. And I sort of make no bones about this. I've been profoundly influenced by German thought. But most of these people would say that they're sort of in an English Burkean tradition or something like that. They do not want to lose the sort of the English connection. But I think the division sort of goes this way, that there are those who believe that America is founded as an Enlightenment country, and the Enlightenment tradition is something that we have to defend. And America's tradition is one of natural rights. And natural rights are universal, and they form the basis of every just society that exists. And the founders of America, when they say that all men are created equal, and they mention these Lockean rights, they're not only speaking for the United States, they're speaking for what is good and decent in all political tradition, which is based on natural right. That is the position of West Coast Straussians, for whose website I write every day. I am not of their persuasion at all, as you know. There is now among the opposition, I think there are several groups, one of which are Southern conservatives, represented by someone like Don Livingston, Brian McLanahan. There are a whole bunch of these people. The late Mel Bradford was in that tradition, the Southern agrarians, there are others. And their argument, my friend Boyd Cathy, but he tries to relate this to Catholic counter-revolutionary thought as well. I think what all these people are saying is that there is tradition in the United States going all the way back. And this tradition was embodied in Southern institutions, which were really based on land, agrarian values, hierarchy, even if these people just happen to speak every now and then about natural right, which of course I've argued they speak about quite often. George Mason and Taylor and Jefferson, they're all speaking, they're all using natural right language till you get to Calhoun, who sounds like a European counter-revolutionary. But up until the 1840s or something like that, they do sound very much like Enlightenment figures. But the Southern conservatives say no, this is sort of not the case. There is not a natural rights. There is an agrarian tradition based on land, loyalty to kin, and so forth. Something which Roland Osterweiss, former professor at Yale, would say the Southern Romantic tradition, antebellum Romantic tradition, which it is. I mean, they were sort of taking this from Europe, and it becomes sort of this is the Southern tradition. And the fight that Bradford had with the neoconservatives was largely over this. It was his rejection, of this natural rights tradition. Then you have another group that's anti-natural rights, who are Catholic, one might say right-wing Catholics, some of whom write for Chronicles. And their argument would be that, if there's anything decent in America, it's natural law going back to the Middle Ages. And the traditions on which America founded are basically medieval, Aristotelian, and there may be some reference to natural right, but it's really not that important. And, we have to look for deeper traditions in the United States. Finally, we come to my position, which is, yes, you do have natural rights, and these people do talk about natural rights, but this really is not as important as other things in the American founding. And I think it's very hard to ignore the strong Protestant character of early America. It's a profoundly Protestant country, deeply Calvinist, in fact, and this cannot be ignored. There also is an emphasis on the United States as an English nation, whose rights really come from England. And, that what we've done is re-embodied what are English rights. An historian like Barry Shane writes about this in his work. And I mean, and some of the our historians of the American Revolution take this position. I don't think one can simply explain away the references to natural right in the Declaration of Independence. They're there. I'm not a fan of natural right. I think it leads to all kinds of dangerous ideas like globalism, global interventionism, and the belief that the United States has some kind of universal mission to save everybody. Also, I think rights have a way of proliferating. So I don't think you can explain it away, but I think there are other, should we say, sort of elements, foundational elements in the American experience, which are very important. Finally, there is a school of thought that emphasizes community in the United States, that although the United States may have some kind of constitutional or natural rights founding, what is most important about America historically are communal relations. There's a very strong sense of community, and the government takes a long time before it becomes intrusive in our lives. Really, it's the progressive era in the 20th century, although there is an American Civil War that occurs that results in taking away the rights of states, pretty much, or making them the plaything of the central government. But there are strong communal ties in the United States, which have nothing to do with natural right. So I think those are some of these other positions. What I think distinguishes my own is that while I agree basically with the Southern conservatives, the Catholic theorists, and the others about the danger of natural rights thinking, looking for other founding elements, but I don't think one can explain away the natural rights theory. I think they are there. What I've typically done, though, is say that rights are important because they're historic rights. And of course, there's the influence of German thought on me, but rights are, and also Burke. And I think rights are historic. They come out of the history and culture of people. And, the Second Amendment is right, not because God injected it into me, but the Second Amendment is important because free men in England and in the rest of Europe were able to bear arms for the last 1,000 years. It's the mark of being a free person, and not being subject to arbitrary control by the state. And I therefore support it. Now, what you see in America is a kind of shortcut, a historical shortcut, that this is a God-given right. I mean, I don't know, why is it a God-given right? It's an historic right. So I mean, that is the kind of argument that I would typically make when people talk about the right to bear arms.
So one of the other great students of Marcuse is Jürgen Habermas, who's living on this side of Europe, and he's often seen as the heir to the Frankfurt School tradition. So I wonder, what do you make of him?
Yeah, he is not a student of Marcuse, really. He's a student of Adorno. He's associated with Adorno and Horkheimer. I have to say, I thought very little of Habermas until a friend sent me his dissertation, which I thought was brilliant. And he was a Heideggerian, of course. He starts out, defending the Daseinsphilosophie of Heidegger. Later on, he becomes consumed with anti-German, anti-nationalism, anti-fascism, German self-hatred, all these other things. And his work on communication doesn't really impress me. And finally, I would say his defense of what he calls a Herrschaftsfreien Diskurs, discourse without having anybody controlling it or domination, is all fake, since he totally wants to control everything we say and do in the name of fighting fascism and a recurrence of Nazism. But he is obviously, looking at his dissertation, I would say my view of the man has changed. And this, his early years, he was a Heideggerian, and then he sort of throws this away and becomes the leader of the second generation of the Frankfurter Schule. By the way, Horkheimer never liked him. He thought he was an opportunist, and he was right. But he did manage to ingratiate himself with Adorno, who gave him some sort of place of honor within the movement. But I'm not sure what his connection is to Marcuse. They may have met, but I don't think he ever viewed himself as a Marcuse disciple.
So Herbert Marcuse made his way from the Frankfurt, I suppose, to California, and I heard that he didn't like it there. He thought that the advanced capitalism and mass culture will create a society much like what Germany has become, and he was very wary of these like bourgeois lifestyles that Americans have, and I wonder if his criticisms still resonate today.
Yeah, I mean, he is a snob at the end of the day, and he really hated Konsumkultur. He was also, he starts out also like Habermas and Ernst Nolte as a Heideggerian, and Hannah Arendt. And Heidegger seems to be sort of the common denominator for all these people. And one of the reasons I suppose he resonated with me, when I was always on the right, is that he really didn't like consumer culture very much, and believed in high standards. He was very upset when he visited Venice and noticed all the tourists who were there, and he called for a turismo de qualità. You have to quality tourism, and that was sort of typical of him. He did like several things in California. One of them was zoos. Like myself, he loved animals, so he gave money to the zoo. He also managed, even in his old age, to have a number of affairs. I just discovered recently that he was married, and I think he was married to the widow of Franz Neumann, who was a German communist who wrote Behemoth, which was translated to English. So I think he may have married Neumann's widow. I have to look into this, but that was always sort of irrelevant in his life because he had so many affairs. He was sort of a practitioner of what became, kind of serial polygamy, depending on his mistress of the day. I really have difficulty seeing him as any kind of feminist, by the way. Um, and I always tell people that I was in the room with him when, and this was at Yale Graduate School, when the decision came down for the Griswold, remember the Griswold decision, about contraception, which was used as an entry point for what later became Roe v. Wade, the abortion law. And I remember there was this very pretty young lady named Eva Pittarelli. She was sort of a Southern belle married to an Italian American architect. And she ran in and said, Professor Marcuse, isn't it wonderful? We're now going to have abortion or something abortion. And he sort of looked at her as if she was crazy. I mean, he had no interest, which I've always, considered a plus point with him, that he the way he reacted to this is what I would expect, of a European male chauvinist of his generation.
Mhm. I think one of the works of his that I have the biggest quarrel with is Repressive Tolerance, in which I suppose he is the pioneer of what we call political correctness or wokeism, and this is where I believe you can make the connection between repressive tolerance and what the anti-free speech wing of the university campuses are about, in that he believes that, much like Adorno, really, that authoritarianism is not contained in the ideas of or ideologies of a person, is in their personality. And like Freudians, they would pick apart certain traits and aspects of a man's personality and decide that whether or not they are an authoritarian person. And Marcuse favors a kind of free speech, but not for the people whom he deems to have, a high level of authoritarianism. So how would you understand that?
No, I think you're right. Yeah, the autoritäre Persönlichkeit, is sort of common. It is a psychological thing. So you have to, re-educate them. And of course, in Repressive Tolerance, he does take a position against allowing, totally free speech, because it would empower people he wants to shut up. Although I can't imagine him sympathizing with wokeness today. I mean, which is sexual perversion, the abolition of gender, all these other stuff that the woke people have imposed on us. But certainly the idea that authoritarianism is something which is psychological, it's the personality, the fascist personality or something like that, can be found in the first generation of the Frankfurt School. But I think this is inherent in the left. As I argued in this piece I wrote on wokeness and Marxism, the left is against free speech. The notion that somehow the left is, open to this, I think, is a myth, taken from sort of select cases from the American Civil Liberties Union. My own experience is the left has always opposed open. Although, by the way, Marcuse was much more tolerant of free speech than any of my sort of neocon left liberal professors in graduate school at Yale. I mean, it was much more open to divergent views than most of these other people were. But I think there is this connection. But what I noticed today, and what I argue in this piece I wrote on Marx was not woke, is that people who are saying, we represent the liberal tradition, we want open, most of them do not. What you get are people like Barry Weiss and Douglas Murray and others who are essentially woke leftists who are being canceled by other woke leftists. And they say, this is the end of the liberal tradition. Well, they're not liberals either in any classical sense. They want speech to be limited to people who agree with them. Or people who are open to their views on sex, on marriage, whatever it is. I mean, they want people like themselves to enjoy the right of freedom. They don't want me to have that right. If they do, they don't want me to be part of their conversation. I can do this off in the corner somewhere. I'll be tolerated there. but I think there is this repressive nature to the left generally. Finally, I would say you also find this in the conservative movement in the United States, the post-war conservative movement, in the name of fighting communism. That, you look under here, there's somebody is going to be sympathetic to the communists. And we really, Wilmore Kendall, the American populist thinker, was very happy to, repress the speech of people, who he thought were pro-communist. We have to really go after them, or people who speak. So I don't think the conservative movement, the post-war conservative movement, has a particularly good record, on open discourse, on Herrschaftsfreie Diskurs, to use Habermas's term. But the left historically has a horrible record. To say that, gee, these people were for open. I don't remember this. I was in graduate school, and I don't remember the leftists being in favor of open discourse. They were, quite happy, quite willing to shut people up. They weren't as violent as they later became. For one thing, they would not have been tolerated back then, because Americans, I think, were still committed to civil liberties at the time. But I think leftist intolerance was a time bomb that just went off.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and over the years, I've since recognized that the anti-woke position that is held by some persons on the left and many on the right has a kind of again, intolerance of its own, right? In that they're not really willing to challenge the views of those who they see as their intellectual opponents, and therefore they build a caricature, a boogeyman of woke culture without ever really defining what it is, and they attack that boogeyman figure instead. And there's a lot of fear mongering too, in that they believe that wokeness is everywhere, but not really.
No, I think you're right. But I don't think we're dealing with a very brainy conservative movement, and they sort of focus on wokeness, but then they define what it is in such a way as to allow anybody, it's okay to be transgendered as long as you're a Republican transgender. So you go on Fox, you see, they have their contributors whom they pay, or they have at least one transgendered who's Republican who's there, Caitlyn Jenner, and they have others too. But half the people they have on are sort of, self-described gays. They've married gays too, who are like, so they really are not that. So they will define for you what is wokeness. And what they do is they find more extreme forms of wokeness, which they then attack. But then when those things become more mainstream, they go along with that as well. And then of course it becomes Republican against Democrats. So people on the Democratic side are attacked as the extreme left or something. If you vote Republican, you're okay. So I think what you see is a combination of opportunism and party politicization, which has taken over the American conservative movement. But I don't think they were particularly tolerant before, and even the conservatives that I grew up, the National Review that I liked back in the 1960s, was always calling for going after people suspected of being communist and so forth. So, and there were, of course, lots and lots of people who were sympathetic to the communists. And as I've argued, most of the left in the United States, until it became woke, was pro-communist, until the fall of the Soviet Union and this. But for decades, I mean, somebody you scratched a person who was on the left, you typically found somebody who was soft on the communists for whatever reason. But I think the right became sort of fixated in this. The other thing I noticed is they really did not care about cultural moral issues very much. It was anti-communism that sort of dominates the conservative movement. I mean, they're obsessed with anti-communism. And to this very day, the conservative movement will call Marxist anything they don't like. This is really Marxist. So somebody is, in favor of getting rid of gender identification in school. This person is a Marxist. I heard this from Mark Levin. And they're not Marxists. This has nothing to do with Marxism, but they're so used to attacking the communist or the Marxist. They, even when they're not around, they go on, saying the same things.
So, final question. I think I've sort of become a conservative at a time when the definition of the word is the most unclear, in that when you list all the prominent journals affiliated with conservatism, you got your National Review, and you got your Commentary, and Claremont Review of Books, yours, your magazine, and the American Conservative. All five of them have five different interpretations of what conservative means, and oftentimes they would pay lip service to anti-woke and anti-left just to make sure that they kind of speak in one voice, so to speak. But the internal divisions of each of the members or groups of the coalition, as I believe illustrated by Matt Continetti's new book, The Rise.
Right.
It's a brilliant book. Makes the definition of conservatism much fuzzier than it seems. So I guess my final question to you is, what should American conservatism be?
Yeah, I mean, this is like asking Karl Marx, what should socialism be? Sort of the vision at the end. I would say that we need is a different right. We have to cancel and replace the one that we now have. And the major problem with this right, what we have, are these people would sooner ally themselves with the left than anything on their right. I think this is a major, of course, Continenti is the same, because he's a neocon, and a very honest neocon. And these people see everything to their right as Hitler. They have the same anti-fascist vision as the left in the United States. What they need is a broader alliance. You can't keep kicking people out as being this or this one. I was kicked out of an organization because I was asked, do you believe that there are IQ differences among different ethnic groups? And I said, I'm not a scientist, but I assumed, you're not supposed to say that. This is, you're not supposed to say anything like this, because, this is bad and the left is going to get angry at us. We might lose our donor or something like that. But they are terrified of everyone on their right. Now, I'm not saying you let neo-Nazis into the club. You obviously draw a line somewhere, but you can have much a much more extensive alliance than what these conservative gatekeepers allow. And of course, they would sooner ally themselves with the left than anybody on their right, which makes it. And the other thing is, you can't keep ceding ground to the left, so that the conservative becomes the transgendered Republican or something like that. I mean, the only thing they're looking at is the left, and trying to pull people over and trying to build some kind of coalition with the loose ends on the left, or the people, the Barry Weiss or somebody else from the New York Times who's a gay Democrat, but might come over to us, if we're nice enough. These people have to look to the right, and they have to find common ground with the right, not with the left, but with the right. And I think, at the end of the day, you do have to draw lines. There's certain people who are unacceptable. People who are neo-Nazis are unacceptable, screaming white nationalists or the other. But there are a hell of a lot of people who are being excluded who should be part of the movement, including most of the populist right below the age of 40. So, I think the conservative movement has to be reconfigured. It's not enough to say, we'll let Paul Gottfried write for, I'm 81, they'll let me write for, but it's not going to make any difference. What you have to have is a different right in the United States. I would say probably more like the French right, which I'm looking at right now. I admire the French right. We need something like that, or the Italian right. Or the Hungarian government, which I like. But it has to be different from what we have. It has to be much more inclusive of the right and much less terrified of the left. It has to look upon the left as its enemy. It has to look upon people as the right as potential allies. So I think that would be the the major difference in, what I think as a reconfiguring or realignment of the right.
Yes, and I think like you, I've never bought into the rhetoric of that many on the right says that, oh, the left controls everything and we are just lowly people, screaming
Oh,
in the
no.
dark. I never
I do
believed
not
that.
believe that for a second.
No.
They are very powerful.
Yeah.
They're very powerful, and they have much better relations with the left than they do with anybody on their right.
Well, on that note, thank you very much,
Mhm.
Paul Gottfried, godfather of paleoconservatism.
Thank you.
Yes, take very good care of yourself, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah. Please send me your address. We'll make sure you get a copy of Chronicles.